This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. New Society Publishers has been a leader in sustainable publishing for over 40 years now. They're an activist, solutions-oriented publisher focused on bringing you tools for a world of change. They've now published over 600 books available both in print and ebooks, as well as an increasing library of audiobook selection as well. They care deeply about both what they publish and how they do business, and so the same thinker and doer approach permeates their in-house work and the books themselves. A certified B Corporation, they print on 100% post-consumer recycled paper, and they are carbon neutral, and they print only in North America, never offshore. And that's just the company themselves. Most importantly, they've got the best selection of books that you need to build your own regenerative, ecological, or community-based projects. You can check out their full list of titles now at newsociety.com. Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Now, one of my favorite topics to cover on this show is how other people with unique skill sets and talents look at the natural world and the ecological design process. I've been really fortunate in my network of designers, educators, farmers, and academics to peer into the specialties of ecological understanding and design thinking from many points of view, and today is one of those opportunities. Now, I first met Henry Anderson through a design project that our mutual friend Juan Pablo was working on in Portugal through the Climate Farmers Pioneer Program. We were looking at a feasibility test for a 50-hectare plot that some investors were considering as an investment in regenerative agriculture. Juan Pablo introduced me to Henry as a colleague who would look into all the potential for leveraging native plant communities for ecological restoration and high-value crops. Now, I was immediately impressed by Henry's extensive knowledge of biomes and plant communities in Portugal, and together we all developed a really elegant mixed agroforestry design for the clients. Now, long story short, the investment wasn't picked up, but all three of us have been good friends ever since, and now I've got Henry back to share some of his knowledge and experience as a biologist and a designer. Now, Henry is a Scottish multidisciplinary designer based in Lisbon, Portugal, with a background in landscape architecture, urban design, and ecological planning. He's accumulated over 14 years of professional experience working for leading architectural and landscape offices from around the world, including in Australia, the Netherlands, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Portugal. Henry now specializes in delivering best practice regenerative solutions for landscape architecture, agriculture, and ecological restoration projects within the Mediterranean biome, and follows an ecology-led process that delivers multifunctional outcomes specific to each project's unique context. Now, in this conversation, we talk at length about the process in which Henry starts to assess and investigate the state of ecological health and identify the plants and the wildlife on a site, essentially his form of reading a landscape. We also look at the tools and the resources that can expand the research process and give insights into historical land use and plant communities to open up more options for design. Now, together we also dissect the concept of natural succession and how you can leverage this trajectory to enhance and speed up the development of your project, and of course a lot more as well. So for those of you who love the deeper science of ecology and biology, but maybe find the academic approach to it a little bit too disconnected, this is the interview for you, since Henry has a unique way of explaining and making connections between the abstract concepts and real-life applications. So I'll hand things over now to Henry Anderson. Welcome, Henry. Great to talk to you again. It's been a little while since we were regularly collaborating. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Oliver. Pleasure to be here. It has been a while, so it's good to catch up. And I'm fine, thank you. Just enjoying the first couple of hot days in Lisbon with the start of summer, so looking forward to that. But everything's good my side.
Nice one, man. How has the season been for you guys? I heard it's been really dry since the spring, like it was.
Yes, it's been really, really dry since February, end of February. We actually had a pretty big series of floods in Lisbon, December, January, and after that, there was a 4-month drought. So I believe since I've lived here, it's been the longest drought period in spring, which is very unusual.
Yeah.
But we had a bit of rain last week, so hopefully that appeases the water gods slightly. we'll see.
Yeah. Well, look, so you and I first got in touch when we collaborated on the second Pioneer program that I was running with climate farmers. And you were helping out our mutual friend, Juan Pablo, to look at the feasibility of a piece of land that you were considering for the development and investment in a regenerative farming project. But before we go into how we worked on that, I'd love to know about, first of all, how did a Scotsman end up in Portugal? And what is it that you do and how you got there?
Well, that's a good question. And my background is as a landscape architect and urban designer. And I was working a lot in Northern Europe. I studied in Edinburgh and worked in Germany and Netherlands. I went to Australia for a bit working there and worked eventually in the UK as well. And well, my parents always had a farm in the south of Portugal, mostly citrus. I think the main crop was mandarins, and we'd go there every Easter to help out with the harvest. And that was a long time. That was about 12 or 13 years we ran that, and I always had this connection to Portugal. So when the time came and I was making a change in direction from working more in corporate landscape architecture, more in urban projects, I really wanted to come back to Portugal, sort of reconnect with my roots and start to explore a different direction within my design approach. So we picked Lisbon as our base. That's how we ended up here, actually, about 3 years ago now.
Brilliant. And so you've been also increasing your studies and your focus on the biology, the plant communities around Portugal. This is what we were relying on you on for the design portion of that project that we collaborated with. Where did the love and the interest for the different biomes and plant communities in Portugal and the Mediterranean come from?
Well, when I was studying, we did a year of botany at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, and my background really is on Northern European temperate flora. So not exactly Mediterranean. And it was back in early 2020, about 2 weeks before COVID started. I went to work on a farm in sort of north central east Portugal in an area called Castelo Branco. For 3 months, I was doing some holistic grazing with sheep and just working a little bit on the vegetable, the market garden and stuff. And I very rarely have these eureka light bulb moments, but I just had this sort of inspiration or this sudden passion to research Portuguese flora. And I knew very little about the ecology of Portugal, or especially central and southern Portugal, the Mediterranean parts of Portugal. But of course, I studied ecology, a bit of botany, and I'm a landscape architect. So I started to look into it, and then it really just snowballed from there. And I started building my own species databases and trying to understand the ecology of the Mediterranean and doing a lot of hiking. So really just getting outside, going to really interesting locations within Portugal that have been fairly well conserved and exhibit a pretty high level of biodiversity. So that was the way to get into it, really, is just get outside, get on foot and go to these places and really just do your own surveys and also understand the geology. So it's super important just to become familiar with the topography and geology of Portugal and really immerse yourself in that. And then you get a much better idea of how to find these plant communities and how to study them and how the different vegetation communities are composed, how the different plants come together as companions and so forth. So that's something you really have to do the desktop studying, but also you really need to get outside and explore and hike, and that's what I did. Yeah.
Well, so we've talked in the past about how the fact that I am in the similar process of doing surveys and understanding the biological communities where I've settled now. And I'm curious, how much did you learn and was useful to you from your academic studies of botany when you went out and did this? And what are some of the main learnings that you did when you just got out in the field and started doing it on a day-to-day basis on your hikes?
Well, the first thing you notice is everything in a seasonal sense is backwards. Everything is upside down, you know? It's
Yeah.
got a long dry summer, mild wet winters. So it's the complete opposite of an Atlantic temperate climate. So everything is dormant during the summer, and springtime is just an absolute explosion of growth. And
If it
it's
rains.
really, yeah, if it rains. And it's, the concentration of the flowering period and everything else. So it's almost like starting from scratch. It's really just unlearning everything you've previously learned and then just being a completely blank slate to absorb all this new information. And that's actually part of the great pleasure in pursuing this. It's really like going back to the basics again and eliminating all your assumptions about nature and trying to relearn everything. But of course, the basic principles of botany apply universally, so that was obviously very helpful. But yeah, it was a very sort of uh, pleasurable experience, and that's what kept motivating me to go forward over the last 3 years and just keep expanding my knowledge. Yeah.
Well, so that knowledge has turned into quite an incredible resource, which is not yet publicly available, but you've been kind enough to give me a window into what you've been building from this survey of yours. Can you talk about this project?
I'd love to. Yeah. So it's a plant database and it's really focused on Portugal, but it's absolutely applicable to the Mediterranean basin as a whole. So the Mediterranean part of Southern Europe, but also to the Mediterranean type climate regions like central Chile, Southwest Australia, South Australia, California, and Western South Africa. So it's essentially a database for anyone interested in landscape, anyone interested in plants, but specifically it's focused on three different themes. It's as let's say a resource for landscape architects, it's a resource for regenerative agriculture, and it's also a resource for ecological restoration. And it tries to marry these three, let's say, fields and creates a database with filters where you can type in and work with 23 data points and then layer up all those filters together to give you very specific planting lists for your exact location. Because I studied landscape architecture actually in an art school. It's a art school in Edinburgh College of Art. And they're part of Edinburgh University, and they really hybridize your landscape design studies with art and ecology.
Mm.
So we did painting, printing, sculpture, metalworking, all of these things together with classic landscape architecture and also studying at the Royal Botanical Gardens. So
What a brilliant combination.
it's very good. It's very sort of conceptual. It's all I mean, you kind of have to teach yourself in a way. It's very hands off, but I like that. And that then gave me also this approach where sense of place, this sort of idea of genus loci, how do landscapes exhibit these unique set of characteristics that give them a very sort of specific set of characteristics that in the mind when you go there you can really identify these places as being to that place as a unique character, right? And that also feeds into the planting, the species that make up that landscape. When you're approaching the design for the projects, you have a property you want to work on. It's very difficult to understand the native vegetation, and it's quite overwhelming because it's so specific to that place. And the database tries to allow you to better understand that. So that's part of it. So what my hope is that when people do use this tool, they're creating very site-specific planting schemes that are characteristic of that very specific location, rather than, I suppose the opposite would be you go to someone's landscape project, whether it's a farm or whether it's a park or private garden or whatever, and you start to see the same species you saw in the last place. And it's like a little bit of a cookie cutter and everything kind of repeats itself. And I think the beauty of landscape is through the hands of a designer is to allow that landscape to express its own character, to sort of reveal that, and that gives the place its identity. But it's also applicable to agriculture because you can really work with local plant species, varieties, phenotypes that are specific to that region, and then create a system that is resilient, but also what I also feel very passionate about is cultural landscapes, because in order to have a regenerative system, we need to take ownership of the landscape. We need to feel like that landscape is ours, so we have a responsibility towards it and a sort of deep respect to look after it. And I think that also comes from having this sense of unique character. It's like gives you that sense of like, this is our place and we want to, look after it for the better.
Yeah, and I really have appreciated your approach to this with a start of research and survey and deep understanding of the place in order to understand that unique character before then going on into the design process. And
Exactly.
I've learned this in kind of a cursory way where you get a lot of the data points. And I mean, perhaps to others it would be very thorough. It's definitely more thorough than the average, where people get to the conclusion of putting whatever, hot species is in the nurseries these days, right? Or just thinking only about some of the aesthetics or the species that they recognize. But I was really opened up to a new world of understanding not only the members of a plant community, but the relationships between them, as well as other elements within that ecology, the microclimate, the soil conditions, the access to water, when we were doing this project together. So
Yes.
maybe you can talk about your process of uncovering and understanding the unique aspects of a biome, of an ecology, before then moving on into design steps.
That's such a fascinating aspect of design. And your classical design process, I suppose you study it yourself or you learn it in architecture school and you follow the creative design process. It's fairly well developed, and that's like, let's say, the Royal British Architects Institute process set of protocols. But when you when you want to take yourself in your own direction with your own work, what I've developed is a very sort of systematic framework to layer on top of that in order to approach projects here in the Mediterranean, and that is essentially using potential natural vegetation as a framework for landscape architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And potential natural vegetation is simply a model that represents in a given area, let's say continental Portugal, the potential vegetation communities that would exist if, let's say, the landscape was just left to its own devices, and it's representative of a combination of climatic and edaphic and ecological connections that would create, like, let's say, a natural mosaic of different communities. So you have that model and you can see specific parts, let's say, of Portugal it's this, it's called a sigmatum. It's essentially the highest order of the vegetation community, and that gives you an idea of what the landscape could be. Let's say you have a brownfield site where it's just, an empty field and there's nothing there. It's an abandoned landscape, let's say a tabula rasa, a completely clear site and nothing there.
Until the death, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, the first part of understanding landscape is to let's say become an archaeologist and reveal the layers of the landscape. So you're thinking of it as a metaphor similar to what a palimpsest is, which is a parchment or a clay tablet they used to have in medieval Europe or in ancient Babylon or in Greece, where they would write on this tablet, and then due to reasons of economy, they would sort of scrape off the text and then rewrite it. But now you can look at it and it's got 10, 20, 30 layers of text underneath. And if you look through a scanning microscope, you can actually learn a lot of information about the ancient Greeks and so forth by understanding these various hidden layers that are just echoed and like shadows of the former body text. And that's very similar with landscapes. So the starting point is to really just unravel the hidden layers below the surface to give you a sense of what was there previously, how was the land managed in the past. And it's also not necessarily literally underneath. It can also become from historic archive images, archive surveys, anecdotal evidence, or local texts from the town hall that reveal certain things. And you layer all of that up. So that's really the starting point of understanding the cultural landscape, because in Europe, all landscapes are anthropogenic. So everything's essentially a managed garden.
Yeah.
And there's been human occupation on every location. So there's always going to be that previous history, let's say. So
And
you've
from what I
got,
can tell, it's been very well recorded as well.
in most places, it's fairly
Or
easy to find out this
it's been
information.
recorded in a lot of other places too, but due to colonialism and a lot of disturbance, we have lost those records. They're fairly intact in a lot of places in Europe still.
Yeah, you do have the local parish churches and town halls, which do have fairly extensive records of this stuff, and
Yeah.
it's continuous, and it's all in the public domain, so you can access it, which is great. And going back to the idea of this sort of brownfield site, this blank land, you've got that sort of cultural understanding, and then on top of that, you can really just start to work with this potential natural vegetation model, the PNV model, and give you like a sense of let's say a good example people might know in Portugal. You have somewhere called the Montado.
Yeah.
It's synonymous with the Dehesa in Spain. It's cork and holm oak managed savanna essentially for the cultivation of livestock, specifically pigs, but also some arable and forestry. And that is it's a fascinating landscape, but it's not homogeneous from an ecological perspective. It's not monolithic. If you look at the PNV model, it's actually many things. It's many different ecological or vegetation communities or sigmatums. And this is all to do really with the underlying geology. So it gives a different soil pH, or it gives a different soil texture when the material weathers and goes into, like the rock goes into its second phase and becomes, let's say, clay. You get these micro varieties all across the Montado. It's incredibly diverse, actually. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really, I think it's really useful to have going into a designer framework, which can give you some structure. So you're not always like scrambling in the dark, let's say, and trying to figure it out on the fly. I think it can be really helpful to give yourself some sort of framework to work towards. And I feel very passionate about ecology and plants. So that's my personal direction, but it's certainly not the only direction you can take your design approach. And there's many ways to do it. That's just my
Absolutely.
personal approach,
Well, look, before we jump to the other steps here, I would love to know your process and what you're looking for when you do these studies that you just mentioned, when you're looking into the archaeological layers that give you insights into previous land management, both on the ground and in the records that you mentioned.
Yeah, so a good place to start is, of course, Google Earth, and then you can just go back in time with the
That's a
history of
really
the
useful.
aerial
I use
photos.
that a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
and
use that
that's
a lot
so
for my own land here.
yeah, it's free. It's downloaded in 5 seconds, and it's really easy to use. So for anybody listening, I think that's the number one place to start. And they do have pretty extensive records going back at least 15 to 20 years. In some places, it's obviously variable, but that will give you really good indications of what was grown there in the past or what kind of vegetation type was there. And it also it's quite interesting because if you flick back and you go back to certain times, the photos are not always taken at the same time of year. So
Yeah.
sometimes you can, let's say, go back to 2009, and then it's like a winter photograph, aerial photograph, and then you can see erosion channels in the photograph from like a heavy rain, perhaps a week earlier, and then you can see the actual hydrological distribution and the way that water flows across your property. But when
Mm-hmm.
you're there, when you go to the place in person, you never see it. And when you look at the other, or let's say the current aerial photo in Google Earth, it's not there because the vegetation has grown back. But
Yeah.
understanding hydrology, of course, is really the starting point to any design in the Mediterranean. And you can glimpse that sometimes in Google Earth. So it's a really good hack to just get
Well,
an understanding of that.
I did that for my place. That's how I really got to understand how much erosion happened of this big flooding event in 2020 that is one of the principal shapers of the land in the last mm, 50, 60 years. Because through the Catalan Geological Society, I was able to get some aerial photos, the first ever aerial photos in 1945 done by the US military as they were surveying Europe for World War II or just after World War II. And since then, although it's not continuous, I've gotten, usually at least one every 20 years until the 2000s where it does become continuous. And seeing where or how the river has changed and moved, how the vegetation communities have both been harvested and replanted in different configurations. And then, like I said, most recently, that erosion from the river and the massive flood event. And, about those aerial images, though I do have stories from neighbors, it connects on a whole different level and you see the impact on the land through images like that.
Yeah. It's really, really helpful, and it doesn't cost you anything. I think that's, so there's no barrier to access. A lot of these GIS programs, and I work a lot in AutoCAD, and it's, you have to pay an annual subscription fee, and it's not free. So I think let's say you're starting a project, having that resource available, it's great, and everyone should adopt it. But there's other resources as well. I mean, you can go to in Portugal, the town hall and the parish. It's called freguesia in Portuguese. It's got records, historical maps. Funnily enough, most of them are hand drawn, and it's really nice. So you see little quirks in the drawings as well, where they highlight certain things the landowner knows specifically only to him, and he'll mark that. So you can really study the historical maps, and it has all the cadasters and all of the hydrology there and the access ways, and that's a really good place to start. But there's also more general resources. Like in Portugal, we have a fantastic website, a really great resource run by the Portuguese Botanical Society called flora.on, and it actually has every recorded plant species in Portugal mapped in cells, in quadrats, all across Portugal, and it gives you so much information. It gives you like the clade, the order, the family, the genus, species, subspecies, varieties. It also gives you all the flowering times of every plant, and it gives you a little bit sometimes of the sort of edaphic conditions of what the plant might want to grow in. And it gives you also like, is it vulnerable? Is it critically endangered? Is it near threatened? It gives you that information as well. And this is an amazing resource, and I don't know if any other EU country that has such a detailed database for that. It doesn't give you much more information than that. It just shows you like a 10 by 10 kilometer square quadrat, and it's like there's a red square there. That plant will be somewhere in that 100 square kilometers, Yeah. But there's also on like a global scale, there's the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, and that actually has like a hexagonal representation of every plant we know of in a spatial format, so mapped out spatially across the world. So you can actually see regional trends with species. So like how they actually, what spatial area they occupy over a global scale. So these resources are really nice to use. But I wouldn't say anything is more important than just going to the landscape and sitting down, closing your eyes, and just experiencing the character of it and how it feels to be there, and then poking around with a spade and observing what plants are already there, and how the soil is, and how the seasons change, and how the from a diurnal cycle, how the space feels. I think that's really the best way to understand that.
Well, talk to me a little about your perspective of going onto a landscape, what you're looking for, what tools you bring, how you look for signs on the place. Because I had the pleasure of going and seeing the site that we were designing together in the Laguna de Albufeira. I think I pronounced that right. And that was an absolute joy because we couldn't take 2 steps anywhere without you pointing out all of the different plants that you recognize, the Latin names, the uses for them, where they grow. Like it was like walking around with a plant dictionary.
Yeah, a kid in a candy store. I would actually say you don't need anything. I would suggest bringing a notepad and a pencil or pen, and recording what you find. Um, if you're interested in finding out the soil, then a spade or a trowel at least would be useful. But I think you can do this really minimally. Having a drone is fantastic. Having a drone that has some LiDAR capabilities or scanning capabilities, amazing. You can do really great surveys of your land using that. But you don't necessarily need it. You can pay for a surveyor to do the topographical survey, and you can then just observe. And of course, you can put a quadrat down, like a sort of net with a wooden frame or so forth, and you can count in your 10 by 10 centimeter squares like the numbers of plants. But I think it's better just to go there and try to identify the plants and try to learn what they are on your land. And I do this because I can identify plant families. So I can see the sort of universal characteristics across families. So I go to a place and then I know it's Amaranthaceae. I know it's an amaranth. So then I can go back to do the desktop study and figure out which amaranth is that, because I know it's an amaranth due to its morphological distinctions. And then I can say, okay, cool. I have a list of, let's say, 40 species instead of 4 million, and that really helps. So that's where I start from. But for anyone interested, it's really just understanding plant families and the characteristics between them. So you can identify a wild garlic, or you can identify a wild daisy, or anything in the daisy family. I think these characteristics are a great place to start. And then I go to then I find a study usually from either the University of Lisbon's Agricultural School or the University of Évora, and they have detailed studies showing the potential natural vegetation in something called synthetic tables. And these give you what's called a releve, where they essentially draw a line through the landscape, they walk down that line, and they record everything on it. And then they characterize those plants into bioindicators. So these plants they have to be there. Let's say Erica australis, that has to be there. That plant has to be there, otherwise it's not that vegetation community. So these bioindicators it's just a few per like community, right? So 2 or 3. And then you have characteristic species, which are far more extensive and will normally be there, but not necessarily. And then below that, you have companions. So they might just pop up here and there. So you have these 3 different categories. So understanding the prevalence of a specific species and its like how much it grows in a certain area is I suppose how you would define it. So how numerous is it, I suppose you would say.
Yeah. And I was first introduced to this process through Mark Shepard's work in restoration agriculture, as he talks about identifying the dominant plant communities in your area as an informant to what is likely to thrive when it comes to selecting cultivars for a farm, for any kind of production unit, and also getting insights as to what animals may be sort of analogous to the wild animal communities that would thrive in that area, right? That would have
heritage breeds
thrive. Yeah.
Yeah, that's going back to the Logo d'Albufeira project. So bringing that conversation full circle. During my research for that project, I came across a plant in the heather family. It's an Erica. It's called Crema album, Portuguese crowberry, which people believe should be renamed as beachberry because it's very much limited to growing on the beach, and it sounds a bit sexier than Portuguese crowberry because the fruit is really interesting. It's completely spherical. It looks like a white, transparent blueberry, a little bit smaller than the cultivated blueberries, especially like the high bush blueberries. They're quite large sometimes, depending on the variety. But a wild blueberry, it's about the same size, and I'm not joking, it's identical in taste to a really good blueberry.
Talking about it, but I've still never come across one.
It's endemic to Portugal, so it only grows in Portugal. There's one small population near Cadiz in Spain, But other than that, the entire global population of this shrub is only growing in Portugal. It's just basically a narrow endemic, limited to 1 or 2 kilometers from the coast, on the Atlantic side and the south coast as well. And I spent maybe a year looking for this bush when it was fruiting. I found it and it was never fruiting. And eventually I got there, and there was this location south of Lisbon, in the Setúbal Peninsula, where I found it. And I ate it and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And then all of a sudden, my tooth crunched on the seed and it's absolutely rock hard. This little seed, it's very hard. I was like, oh my God, please don't tell me I've chipped my tooth. I was fine. But I was like, okay, well, this is something I think for this Lagoda project would be a fantastic species to domesticate. Yeah. To start a breeding program and actually bring this online, because there's so much marketability there. It's incredibly high in antioxidants, phytonutrients. It's completely drought tolerant. So it requires very little water. It's evergreen, so it looks nice throughout the year. And the white berries also look really, really interesting and fun. It's great for wildlife. A lot of birds eat the seeds. And it has a history of consumption. They found, when they were excavating a building site in central Lisbon, where the old Roman city used to be, they found a basement. And in the basement, there was evidence of fig seeds. There was evidence of acorns from oaks. And then there was crowberry seeds. In a 2,100-year-old site, someone had been foraging these crowberries on the coast and brought them to Lisbon and sold them to some middle-class craftsman or merchant in the city, and they'd obviously discarded it in their waste, and it's been there preserved. So it has a history of consumption, but not of domestication. So we looked into it and found this scientific paper authored by a professor at the University of Lisbon, essentially laying out the roadmap to domestication for this plant. So that then gave us the confidence to say, okay, well, we can integrate this species into the site because it was right next to the coast, 500 meters from one of these populations of wild crowberries. So it's about saying, okay, what's the potential natural vegetation and what species can we try to use on this property that represent that and essentially offer an ecological service along with the product. So it's that, and then also thinking about when you have cultivars, they are mostly clones of themselves. So it's also about preserving genetic diversity and having a wider expression of phenotypes within the plant. So it has future resilience to pests and diseases and climate change. This is really critical, I think, going forward. I know that you're, of course, a huge fan of perennial edibles, and I think that's so important. And I also think the genetic preservation of the phenotypes is also really important. And people perhaps don't think about that too much when they're cultivating plants, especially perennials, that they're cuttings and they're clones of other plants, one parent, and they have often very weak genetic diversity and resistance.
Or even if they are seeds, they've been bred into a genetic what would you call it, like a cul-de-sac, basically, where all it can do is turn around. Yes. It can't go forward.
I love that expression, cul-de-sac. Yeah, exactly that. There's no way out.
Dead end, they mostly refer to it as,
Yeah, exactly. So there's still many wild plants out there that we can domesticate, cultivate, and are absolutely delicious and super healthy for you. So yeah, that was the focus of that project at Lagoa da Albufeira, was try to first of all rename it the beachberry so people would buy it.
Hey, we can switch from rapeseed to canola. I think we can go from crowberry to beachberry.
I think so. I feel fairly confident about that. Yeah.
Well, I love that illustration. That was definitely one of the more interesting ones that we explored during that project. But we did this for everything. This is really where I was blown away by your process because of your knowledge of plants and the different communities that they go along with in the area of all of Portugal and the Mediterranean. You were able to offer us insights by doing a survey of what would likely thrive and is already present on the site as a 50-hectare site I guess we need to give a little bit of background information on this before I go.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so we were brought this project by Juan Pablo, and he was helping to represent a company that was looking at the feasibility of investing in this land, of its potential to produce high value crops, uh, be a demonstration site for regenerative production in this unique area of this laguna, which is about an hour south of Lisbon. Is that about right? Even closer,
Yeah,
maybe?
about 45 minutes. Yeah,
Yeah.
50 minutes.
And because of the unique ecology there, there were opportunities to try cultivars, both perennial and annual, that would be difficult to cultivate in other areas because, as in the description of Laguna, it was a laguna of seawater that incurred into the, the mainland a little bit and created this little pocket of biodiversity that again opened up a lot of options. And because of your understanding of the plant communities there, you were able to identify the wild plants that were already thriving there and the knowledge of what else was in that family to basically do a survey of what profitable cultivars would thrive there with
Right.
very little maintenance and the communities of others that it would support for the development into later successional stages from its current state of being pretty degraded. Is that a good
Yeah,
summary of what we were doing?
absolutely. That was it in a nutshell. That's what we were that's what we were trying to do.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so I mean, I understood a little of the plant communities that we were looking at further inland, but I had no idea of all of the options of very nutritionist or nutritionist nutrition rich and valuable kind of lesser known species that grow so close to the coast. Most people think of because of the salt in the sand and the fact that there's not much organic matter in those soils, there's very little options for cultivars. But maybe you can refresh my memory of some of the
Mm.
ideas that came up in that area.
Right. Yeah. So just sort of as an overview, the Mediterranean has a very specific climate where you have this summer drought it varies between location within the Mediterranean, but let's say somewhere between 2 months and 6 months, there's no rain over summer. And that it's a very harsh routine for a plant to survive. So what they do is they produce their own sunscreen, which we know as antioxidants. Essentially, they're just secondary metabolites or polyphenols that they have an SPF factor. So they absorb the ultraviolet radiation and prevent the cells from being damaged through radiation, through solar radiation. And so they don't get cell damage. And those chemicals are obviously fantastic for our bodies, but we don't actually consume them. They feed our gut microflora. So the bacteria in our gut, they eat that. And then they produce serotonin and various other hormones, but also especially a lot to do with like your immune system, right? So having these wild or semi-wild cultivars, or even just cultivated plants that are high in antioxidants, is just a really nice, like nutrient dense food is obviously really a big thing now, and that's one way to sort of look at it from a culinary perspective. But for an overview of this property, which I'll tie that little conversation into, it's a river valley, 50 hectares. There's a temporary Mediterranean watercourse that runs through the middle of it, and it's fairly flat. And then there's a sort of embankments on either side, which are sand dunes from, I think, the Pleistocene period epoch, like were wind blown off the ocean for 20,000 years and built up there. And then you have this flat sort of meadow area in the middle. But when you move towards the north of the property, you actually encounter this beautiful lagoon. It's a brackish lagoon. It's one of the main locations for flamingos nesting sites on their way up north from Africa. So it's really beautifully preserved. There's huge reed beds and willow forests and everything. But the lagoon is very close to the northern corner of the property. And we were looking at, it's like, okay, well, where's our starting point? And I thought, okay, well, if you think about it's going to be sea level rise in the future from global climate change, then you're going to get saline incursion coming into the subsoil from the lagoon. So groundwater is going to be saturated with salts. So we propose to have this essentially sea vegetable agroforestry system on the northern part of the property, and that really helped to start the process off and define what that could be, And we had all sorts of proposals, all perennials like glassworts and everything else, which samphire, that's very popular vegetable in restaurants along with fish, grilled fish, Those kind of crops would grow quite happily there. And, let's say commercializing that in an agroforestry system is great because there's a market in Portugal, because Portugal is actually the world's third largest consumer of seafood, I believe, in the world. It's Japan, of course, I think Iceland, and then Portugal. Wow. So there's a huge market for sea vegetables as well. And that was like the starting point. And then, of course, you have the watercourse that runs through the middle of the property, and that's like a spine. So there was the proposal to create something called beaver dam analogs, where you sort of recreate through partial damming of the watercourse, you raise the level and you reconnect the floodplain with the channel, because it was very incised and people had been straightening it and neglecting it, so the channel had become deeper and deeper. And we really wanted to return that relationship between the floodplain and the stream bed. And along there would be like a riparian gallery of white willow and black alder, and then a slightly higher ground would be like white poplar, like a white poplar gallery, because that's not a hydrophyte. That doesn't like to have completely anoxic conditions, anaerobic conditions. So we had that sort of idea, and then beyond that, it was really just, okay, well, we have this really fertile, flat, alluvial agricultural land. Why don't we just do like a black mulberry, Morus nigra system, because it's a Mediterranean native, and to be honest, I prefer the taste. Yeah. I prefer the taste of the black mulberry really to the white one.
For the animals, and
it's got the highest dry matter nutrient content of any perennial for forage for ruminants. It has the most digestibility, the highest nutrient content, the highest amount of, or best balance of carbs, protein, and fats. So, creating a dry season fodder bank where you can lop off all the black mulberry and feed that to, let's say, a sheep that's holistically grazed and rotated through these meadows, gives you the fertility. And, coppicing these mulberries also then increases soil carbon sequestration by root sheathing. And then you've got shade. So, got a place for the livestock to be during midday, but you've also got a cooling of the surface. So you're doing all these ecosystem services, but everything is somehow linked to an ecological condition within the property. So it's very much intimately linked. And then as you move to the let's say edges in landscapes, edges are perhaps the most important condition you have to look at. So how does one place, one property, one habitat interact with another? And that's something called an ecotone. And it's, let's say, a little bit of a hybrid of the two habitats coming together, but it's usually linear. It's usually like a long line, right? It's a very narrow, long line. That's the exciting point. That's where you get speciation. That's where you get evolution. That's where different plants evolve to become different species. And there's an interaction between animals, because, you're moving from, let's say, a forest where they live to a meadow where they're hunting. So you have that sort of, and that was really important part of the project, where we had this very, very, very biodiverse polyculture agroforestry, essentially like a food forest that was like a linear belt that ran around the property, and then that transitioned into maritime pines, which were existing. And that's, I wouldn't say no one's really sure if that's a native or not. But, it's naturalized, and it's certainly native to Portugal, somewhere in the north, perhaps. But it's extensively planted, second only to eucalyptus here. So we wanted to respect that, and it's also about respecting things within the landscape and integrating them into the project and having that balance between new things and old things, or existing and proposed. But that's that's the overview of the design, more or less.
Yeah, and I learned so much from that, not only from your process, but through the analysis of the economic potential of these lesser known cultivars and finding a niche market. I think there's huge potential there for, much like you said at the beginning, rediscovering the cultural and the unique aspects of any given site for the potentiation of different culinary aspects, ecosystem services, and everything that comes along with it, including even the culture of people's relationship to that landscape, because
Yep.
there's an inevitable reconnection to perhaps old or lost practices of caring for these cultivars that are not as common anymore. And quite frankly, they're worth more because it's a shame that we have picked about 7 different cultivars to basically
Mm.
cover the world with. And whether or not they are appropriate for the places that they're planted in, there's a massive market and a demand for it. So people do it and it's easy, right? But this is where we run into the problems of landscape degradation and everything that is the knock-on effect from that, right? The loss of nutrients in our diets, the loss of cultural connection to stewardship of the land in the way that people have done so previously. And this approach to designing a farm seems to connect all of these missing pieces. And it's just a matter of unfolding and managing it through its maturation over time. It was so inspiring and exciting to be working on this. And we got to go a lot deeper than even other things similar to this that I had practiced on previous projects. It's really a shame that they didn't pick it up because in the end they didn't make the
Yeah.
investment and
They
the
didn't get
project.
the, yeah, the exactly the stakeholders didn't get the funding in the end. So they
Yeah,
just
that's amazing.
they had the feasibility study essentially from us, but
Yeah.
well, it was a unique place. And I also feel like maybe I can give one other brief example because that was such a specific place.
Yes, it was.
It's maybe not like scalable in that sense. The approach is scalable, but the specific peculiarities of that place were unique to that location. But
Maybe give us one that might be more relatable.
yeah, so we briefly mentioned before we came on today about my partner and I. We are looking to purchase some land in Alentejo in the south central Portugal. The owner's already accepted our offer, but by law we just have to wait for the lawyers to contact the neighboring owners to see if they want to buy it first at the offer we agreed with. So it's not secure, but that essentially that I don't want to give away too much of this project, but it's going to be my personal project of developing essentially a ecological slash botanical garden for thermo-Mediterranean areas. And it's a unique place. It's just like the rock is actually like seabed that was lifted up millions of years ago and formed like alkali basalts. So it's really rare geology and it has very unique mineral composition. But essentially, in a nutshell, it's substep slash montado. So one of the proposals, just like off the top of my head, I was like, oh, cool. It's probably like Quercus rotundifolia, the holm oak, myrtle, Myrtus communis, and Pyrrhus bourgeonnier, the Iberian pear. Why don't you combine that into a system where the holm oak gives you, these are all the potential natural vegetation for that specific location. Why don't you combine it into a system where the holm oak produces acorns to rear pigs, the common myrtle gives you essential oil, and then the Iberian pear also feeds the pig during the summer, and then they can move on to the acorns in autumn. And they're all native to the location, but you're getting like a full annual cycle of nutrient cycling and ecosystem services from that, but you're not sacrificing productivity.
Yeah, yeah.
You're
Very
actually
exciting.
getting
How big is
multiple
the plot again?
21 hectares. So
Yeah,
still
that'll keep you busy.
medium sized place. Yeah, it's pretty chunky property. It's includes a mountain. We would essentially be purchasing the tallest point in that part of Alentejo, which is a 300-meter peak. So you can almost see the ocean from there, even though it's nowhere near the
Wow.
ocean. So it's a pretty exciting place, and it's the most biodiverse part of Alentejo. This little area of alkali basal outcroppings. It has an insane number of aromatic perennials just growing wild. Like there's rosemary everywhere, but there's many other species. But also has incredible that biodiversity of geophytes. So bulbs, rhizome, corm, tuber plants. They're everywhere in spring. They come up because they can survive the drought there really well. Of course, their perenniating buds are below ground, so they don't get affected by the hot summers. So they are just everywhere. We went in springtime and it was just insane. It's like
That's so
absolutely
exciting.
bulb parade. But that would be focused on becoming an educational institution for better understanding land management, best practice land management for the in a Mediterranean context. I think that, that'd be a really exciting project to do there. Due to the it's like let's say an archetype for the Montado, which is this very large agroforestry system, maybe the most sustainable agricultural system in the world, arguably. And then you
Or at least
have
in that
this,
region, yeah.
yeah, it's certainly one of them. And then you have this, let's say, hotspot of biodiversity within the Montado. It's like, how do you marry this commercial production with ecological restoration or conservation?
Yeah.
And then you're looking at all the wild plants that grow there, like rampion and everything else, and trying to integrate that in. Also, do you know black salsify or scorzonera? It's this root vegetable.
I've definitely heard of it. I can't think of it off the top of my head.
Actually delicious. I got it at a farmer's market a couple of years ago in Lisbon. Just grilled it with garlic butter, and it's super nice. It's a prebiotic. It's full of inulin as well, and it's really just growing everywhere on the property, and it's a pretty rare plant in Portugal. And so yeah, so we take let's say a cultivar, breed it with the wild one, and create like a unique cultivar for that property, and then that's one of the cash crops, you can say, of the place. It's like, we have this amazing scorzonera we sell, or rampion we forage, or whatever. So yeah, anyway, I just wanted to maybe give a more relatable example that's, a lot of people can relate to the Montado.
Yeah, I love that. And much like the other projects, the selling point is in all of the unique things that you can do that allow you to create your own market for products that either others are not cultivating or are underappreciated in the general population, but have a niche market, let's say with chefs or other people who really value this and how rare it is, to get a premium, even though you're not probably going to reach a production scale the way most farmers would think about it. And this, I mean, I've definitely seen a few examples where this is by far more profitable for the amount of labor put into it, especially because we're talking about plants that already grow with minimal maintenance and amendments to the conditions. This attitude of not only working with the existing vegetation in the communities that are already there, but continuing to breed for adaptation to the changes that are inevitably going to happen, so that you stay a couple of steps ahead and can save on all of the work, maintenance, and inputs that would otherwise be required to adjust the conditions to something that's more delicate or less adapted to the place.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually, interesting enough, that's currently a conversation I'm having with one of my clients from my design practice, my landscape architecture practice here in Lisbon. They have this beautiful 10-hectare property south of Lisbon in Grandola. It's these low hills off the Atlantic, and she one of the client, she really wants to integrate the production of essential oils, and she was obviously saying, "Oh, I'd love sage, love lavender, love rosemary," but I was like, "Well, why don't we also integrate all of these native plants from your forest, because they have this beautiful mountain full of cork and myrtle and viburnum, and there's so much growing there. There's just wild oregano everywhere. So like, how do you integrate that into your essential oil production as well, and create a system out of that where it's going to be a hotel, so you can engage the clients visiting with the actual landscape itself, so you understand for farm to fork, or whatever. It's that process, but all for essential oils, so they can really see, like, they're not just the seeds are not just imported from Turkey or something. It's like you're collecting the seeds on the spot, and it's essentially representing that locality and creating cultivars that are, let's say, marketable for your region as well. Like, if you want to sell the seeds or give the seeds away, you can do that, and that your friend or your customer will be able to just grow them easily. That's the best part about it.
Absolutely. And it sounds radical when compared to the predominant cultivation and farming model that we have at the moment, but this is exactly how it was always done not that long ago. We're talking maybe 100, 150 years ago for the most part. And
Yeah.
this is really what created the unique and exciting aspects of traveling to a new place. Instead of just seeing the same restaurants and the same cultivars of tomatoes across every continent that you visit, I can vouch for that because I've traveled quite a bit. It's depressing to have lost so much of this unique, not only flavor but nutrition and the cultures that interacted with them and that had festivals around their harvests and traditions of cooking these recipes from what was found, what was easily
Yeah.
grown in this area, as well as the wildlife that lived off of it. And not only does it create an ecology that is more a culture that is more adapted to the ecology that it lives within, but it is much more resilient. It is much more interesting, certainly from an outside perspective. And to me, it's the only inspiring part of a future vision for regenerative agriculture that I feel does not get talked about enough, right? We very easily get caught up in the conversation about how to improve soil health so that we can optimize these cultivars that quite frankly are not adapted to the place that we're trying to force them into. So yes, you can put in all of the effort to improve the soil so you can grow corn in this place that it was never adapted to do so. And there is something to be said for doing landrace breeding so that those are easier to cultivate in that area. But we could also rediscover what used to be grown there and the cultures that were formed around that. To me, it's much more of an inspiring vision than just improving the ecological health with the same mindset of producing what the massive system is trying to consume in
Yes.
the first place.
And you could definitely, exactly, and you can take that approach and say, well, instead of having a monoculture of corn, you can really say, okay, well, I integrate, native plants in strips, like it's very commonly done as hedgerows or whatever, and then you can have the corn in between and have this sort of barcode system, and that's like that's a compromise, I suppose, and that's, I suppose,
It's a
the
yes
starting
and
point.
Yeah, exactly. Because not only is it still necessary to feed the system as it is, like we can't just do a 180 turn all at once, but this would be a transitional mechanism to continuing with an existing enterprise that perhaps you have a lot of sunk cost into, the machinery to do it. I mean, you have to pay
Yeah,
back those loans.
exactly.
I totally understand it from a pragmatic perspective, but you can start to integrate these other cultivars and transition the ecosystem towards something that is essentially independent of the need for these inputs and so much of the maintenance and the cost that we've
Yeah.
got used to. Yeah.
Well,
In the same time, developing the markets, perhaps they don't exist yet, but you can do this in a timeline that is reasonable to start to introduce them, find buyers, educate consumers, because it's
yeah.
unlikely you're going to be able to do that all at once, right?
Exactly. And yeah, like you said, it's all about balancing inputs with profit. And if your inputs are non-existent, if your inputs are close to zero, then you're really free to experiment, or more free to experiment. And when your margins are much tighter and your inputs are high, you're less likely to experiment because you simply don't have the luxury of doing so. So I think taking really simple approaches like studying or learning about the research from Dr. Christine Jones from Australia, where she's the leading expert on soil restoration in Australia and works a lot in the Mediterranean part, the Mallee and Southern Australia regions, where she's really just saying to farmers, like transition to grazing, don't leave your fields fallow over summer, and then use this very diverse seed mix for your permanent pastures, your improved pastures. And it doesn't matter, even if they're, let's say, Mediterranean plants, there's chicory, plantain, and various other perennial herbs. It's still better than what they're doing currently because they're providing synergy, right? So all the different plant families have specific bacteria that colonize their rhizosphere and their roots, as well as fungi. And the more family diversity you have, the more different groups of bacteria you have. So then the soil self improves through that method, right? You are doing a one-off purchase of seeds, and then you're creating a permanent perennial pasture that self-seeds itself every season, right?
Yeah.
So low cost, really. But and of course, a lot of people are heading in that direction, which is fantastic.
And with that perspective of making that transition and starting a new trajectory towards a stable, resilient, and perennial ecosystem, kind of brings me back to what we touched on a little earlier, which is successional plant communities. They go through a natural succession based on the conditions that you currently find them in and what the state of equilibrium it's trying to balance itself out at towards later stages of maturity. How do you consider that in your design thinking, and as well as consider the maintenance that is necessary as the system starts to mature and reach a different state of evolution over
That's a great question. It's really specific to every place, but I think there's two starting points for that. Well, one would be the hydrology, and the other one would be the level of anthropogenic disturbance that the previous stewards of the land had incurred. That will give you a sense of the carrying capacity and the net primary productivity potential of the land. So it's really fun when you work on a project to imagine it being this climax successional state eventually, right? Where you have these huge oak trees or whatever. But often the potential for that soil can no longer sustain that seral stage, that climatic vegetation community. So it would become what's known as a geoseries, where even though it has the right climate, the right rainfall, and so on and so forth, there's like an edaphic limiting factor where the soils might have an excess of a mineral, like aluminium or something, or magnesium, which actually creates, like, let's say, a scrubland surrounded by a forest. So you have these little quirks in the lithology where it limits the climax potential, but that's then you have to think about that. Let's say from a cultural perspective, humans are creating that geoseries artificially by changing the mineral profiles of soils, right? So what you cannot model with this potential natural vegetation really on a larger scale is the micro differences between properties. So one landowner could have used excessive amounts of some nutrient like sulfur, let's say, to bring the pH down, but then that's because everything in the mineral table, everything's opposite each other, right? Copper and zinc and so on and forth, they have like a synergy. So sulfur could interact with other minerals and change the soil profile, and you end up creating like a Frankenstein plant community. When it's abandoned, it turns into this really interesting, not in any way representative of a natural system, but there's a beauty in that as well.
Yeah.
There's a beauty in that as well, because then it creates the grounds for new evolution and new speciation and new interactions between plants. So I really do, on a more sort of, let's say, higher level, I really do feel pretty comfortable with human manipulation of the landscape. I'm not suggesting we just rewild everything and leave it alone. I really do think, and this is a very important thing for the Mediterranean, is that the reason there's many reasons why the Mediterranean is biodiverse. It has a unique climate. The Mediterranean basin is very topographically and geologically diverse. It's the convergence of three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe, but it's also a glacial refugia where plants were able to survive the ice ages in little microclimates on the south-facing slopes right next to the Mediterranean Sea. But all of these things, they sort of like relate to creating like unique conditions on the side, and that is something you can only really study by going there and understanding like how this Mediterranean biodiversity sort of exists at a local scale. It's difficult to map that at any like meaningful resolution. So yeah, that's the fun part, is going there and understanding that. But succession in the general sense, I think it comes useful when you're trying to model things. So you're trying to, let's say, do the master plan for your property, and you want to know in rough terms what parts of the property are going to be. Let's say you have ecological corridors, like like a matrix or a riparian corridor, or a mosaic or something. Then you can sort of model it, and then you can test it. So you can just try to grow certain things, very fast growing herbaceous perennials or annuals, and then see how they do. And then you can sort of like through trial and error, you like do some test plots around the whole property, and you see which species perform well. And then does one become invasive? Does it become too dominant? And then okay, let's remove that from the mix and let's replace that with something maybe a little bit slower growing. And then you can sort of like say, oh, okay, well, then maybe the large trees that might come in 30 years relate to those species that are doing well, those perennial herbaceous perennials that are doing well. So you can work out over a couple of years maybe what because let's say it's chicory, right? It has obviously like a specific condition. It likes heavy clay soils. It can tolerate alkalinity. It likes compacted soils. It's mesic, or no, it's not. It's moderately drought tolerant, and then it's like surrounded more in like a mesic community where you have continuous water, but it can tolerate periods of dryness. So that gives you like a sense. Okay, cool. Well, then that's probably going to be Fraxinus angustifolia, the narrow-leaved ash, with maybe bay tree, or perhaps some willows or some poplars or whatever else. And you can sort of like, if the chicory does well, then right? Because you can't test out a tree; it's going to take 30 years. But you can test out a small herb over 2 years, and then okay, cool. So that can grow. That'll probably be fine to plant ash trees, bay trees, or willows or poplars. So that's a little hack you can do, really.
This is really interesting for me because I did not study all of this at an academic level. I'm really just an enthusiast who is kind of putting myself on an accelerated learning here through the identification of species and also understanding not only successional models, but also correlations between soil types. Because we are in a very unique little area of Spain here, a lot of people make assumptions that we have some of the characteristics of what they see in other places, like olive groves and figs and clay soils and all these other things that are often thought of in this area. And we have almost none of that because of where we are. The decomposed granitic soils of the mountains of the pre-littoral range in between the Pyrenees and the coastal range, and the microclimate that comes along with that, and the fact that we're in a riparian corridor because the river runs right through the middle of the property. And so I've had to throw out much of what I learned from where I was living previously to this, and much like you had to do with your education of the northern climates where you first studied, completely start over in understanding the ecology of this new place. And since we're on a similar trajectory, you and I, of working to set up educational facilities and centers where we can demonstrate a lot of this and bring people along to this world that we're so passionate about, I'm curious, from a perspective of someone who already has the academic learning, how are you thinking of bringing people in who don't have this background and making it accessible so that they can kind of run with it on their own whenever they leave a course or a session that you would host?
That's another great question. And just touching on what you mentioned about your property, I would definitely have to come and visit it because it does sound pretty unique, and I think I'll really enjoy exploring that place. Actually,
there's some good ideas and insights, but there's, like you said, there's nothing like seeing it in person.
Yeah, I love how you said you have to throw out all these like preconceived notions, and then really just say, okay, this is going to be a unique beast we have to tackle from. Go back to the start and like deal with it from your own personal perspective. That's really that's exciting, I suppose.
Well, it's good because I don't come into it with too many preconceived notions and try and make conclusions that are really inaccurate, right?
And then you become intimately knowledgeable about your land. You become the expert of your place. So you are the sort of the owner of that knowledge, which is nice. But going back to what you asked about, let's say, accessibility, partly this database that I'm hoping to launch in a website format, either as a downloadable or actually hosted on the website itself as a database. I'm hoping to make that available, this year, of course, some point. And the thinking behind that, and we touched on this at the beginning of our conversation, was to give landowners the opportunity of creating something specific, site specific for their properties within the Mediterranean, and really just embracing that crazy level of biodiversity that you have here, because that's something that's not really known. Is the Mediterranean basin is the third most biodiverse place on planet Earth for plants, after the tropical Andes and the Indonesian rainforest. It's the Mediterranean basin.
Yeah.
So it has 25,000 endemic species. 16,000 endemic species, 25,000 species in total. That's a lot. It's like 4 times the biodiversity of the Congo rainforest. 8 times the biodiversity of most of China, apart from Yunnan. So you're looking at crazy levels of endemism and crazy biodiversity. But the idea of the database is essentially to give people who might be new to farming or ecological restoration, or want to design their property, the opportunity to really just make a meaningful and site-specific design and enhance the biodiversity, rather than bringing flora from nurseries that are of very little value. You can really offer a service that people can use quite quickly and easily to like create this list of plants specific to their plot. But also just like talk to your. This is just a time-tested thing. Everyone will know this. Just talk to your neighbors.
Yeah.
That would be my second suggestion, because with this property down in Alentejo we're looking at buying, we actually brought a local farm engineer with us, and he'd been working there designing citrus farms and various other projects here, around the whole region. So he immediately confirmed, like, I was like, is this gabbro? Is this gabbro, the rock? And he's like, yep. So I was like, oh, cool. I mean, I'm not a geologist. I can't tell just by like glancing at it. I really need to like research it to understand it.
Yeah.
But he just confirmed that straight away. So it's like, okay, well, that's 2 days of research I don't have to do.
Yeah.
And that's the nice thing. It's like talking to the neighbors will also give you like the options of planning. It's like, oh, well, we'll have access to a tractor. I'm not going to buy one, but my neighbor, because there was also the farmer, the son of the landowner was a farmer, and he can obviously lend us the tractor if we, and he was like, yeah, of course, we'll, give you that. So like making interventions at the beginning or managing your system is a lot more approachable if you're not having to, put up the upfront costs all at once.
Yeah.
I think so. Those 2 things, like having a database to understand your ecology, and then also having like local support in the community. I think these two things are great. I think you can go a long way with that. Yeah.
As far as skills or knowledge that can help to shortcut this process or the learning journey itself, what are you excited to teach people who come to your place, or people who you interact with, about how they can start to adopt the responsibility and the stewardship for the places that they are looking at?
Definitely go hiking around your local area and understand the different landscape types. Understand, the character of your place. So when you come back to your property, you have this memory, this impression. And I think that can help to inform you going forward with the design. But on a more practical level, I think really just reading, studying a little bit about the creative design process. So you have some great approaches, like in permaculture, there's a specific approach that you can take. In landscape architecture, there's a specific approach you can take. So these are great because they remove a lot of the guessing, and you can work towards a master plan that is feasible. You can actually deliver the master plan, and then it's also easier to construct and implement the design. So I think getting a foundational knowledge of the creative process, and you've got many choices, so you can really, there's a lot of flavor there, so you can really choose what you like, right? There's not just one approach. So you just find what you're interested in, and then find the approach that's equivalent. and just, you don't need to be an expert in it, but just understand it's okay to not know something. So it's okay to feel anxious, and you're going through the design process and you're like, oh, I'm not really sure how this is going to turn out. My advice would just be to keep going, and it's like a cloud or a mist. The truth, the solution will just emerge out of it. And if it doesn't, then that's fine. You just go to like a second iteration of the process, and then try to figure out, okay, what didn't work, and then integrate that into your next iteration. And then having more iterations is always better, right? So you can see the journey, and if there are elements that you did really well at the very beginning, that you can go back to that and say, oh, actually, I might take this element and integrate it into the new iteration of the master plan. But not worrying about having unresolved situations within your design process, and not worrying about how the master plan might look or perform. It's really just having that sort of faith. But that comes from experience. That comes from practice.
Yeah.
You know, you don't need to study much for that. You don't need to know anything academic. It's more like stubbornness, not giving up. Just keep going with the master plan. Get it to a point where you're knowing it just so well that it's like second nature. It's like breathing. You can just modify it and modify it to the point where it works. And then one day you'll be like, oh, crap, this is actually functional. I can implement this, you know?
Yeah.
Let's go find some contractors, or let's do it myself, you know? So yeah,
I agree. I've found a lot of assistance in the balance between the gathering of data, consulting with neighbors and locals, people with experience in the area, and also just the acceptance of the humility that comes with living dynamic systems, and the fact that they're not going to do exactly what you want. There's no hope in really controlling them, and running a lot of experiments to gain the experience that then starts to give you more accurate insights and a higher chance of success. And just, realizing that you're going to continue to make big mistakes throughout the entire journey, but that's not wrong, right? It was really liberating to me when I started to internalize that, and that mistakes are really only defined by the expectations that you started out with. And it could actually be a success if you could just change your mindset or be more flexible in what you consider a positive outcome, right? Sometimes a positive outcome is just you will learn not to do that again. That's not wrong,
Yeah.
But also that it's not possible for at least an individual, and maybe not even a population, to understand the complexities of a dynamic living system in its entirety. And that something that does not end up with the results that you were hoping for, that maybe you even needed, does not necessarily mean that it's a bad step or it's a setback in the overall health and progression of the system that you're hoping to steward. Something that I still am constantly humbled by, even in these early stages, especially in these early stages of working with my landscape. And something that I always try and keep in mind when working with clients too, who don't have this experience, to set realistic expectations and to cultivate a mindset of observation and humility in knowing that you're going to be in the experimental phase for the entire duration of your life and for this project, and just accepting that and having fun with it. Ultimately, like, this is a lifestyle, this is a long-term process. This isn't you come up with a master plan, you implement it, and then things just start going well. I mean, That's what we would hope for, but it's not realistic. There's course correction, there's learning and observation at every single step of the way.
Yeah, you have, phases in the master plan. So phase one is trial by fire, otherwise known as trial by fire. Phase two is getting your sea legs, and then phase three is just gliding. So you don't implement the whole project at once, right? You sort of do a small part, see how that performs, and then course correct for the second phase. And I think that's like a didactic process that works really well. But also just thinking about a project that you showed me a while back. I believe it's in Guatemala that you were involved with, and it was on this sort of like small mountain stream. and they had these
Oh
beautiful
yeah, the one that did
gardens.
the little documentary of in Quiche.
Yeah, the one you did the documentary on. And
Yeah,
I think at the beginning of the documentary they said there was something like they had a huge litter or waste problem
yeah, yeah,
in that watershed.
yeah.
And
So trash management was still a big challenge for them. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And to see like, how far they had come, I'm sure that there was a lot of challenges in engaging and changing people's, let's say, cultural practices, but also cleaning up the property and then redesigning the hydrology of that place. It's a beautiful project you showed me, and what you were talking about reminded me of that. It's that was not built in one day.
no, by no means. Yeah,
No way, no way. So
that is multi-generational, full community buy-in, and yeah, I'm sure if I had had more time, they could have told me about all of the things that didn't work out as they were reaching
right,
that
right.
iteration, and probably how many more things that they would change if they had the time and the resources. You know.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was a really nice project to showcase that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'll make sure to post a link to that in the show notes for this for reference. It's the Kishaya CPEC organization in the mountains of Guatemala. For having forgotten the name of the county. Nice. So look, although this I think is a really good place to wrap up this conversation, there's one more aspect that I would like to talk about because your focus is really on the plant ecologies. It's where your passion lies, and I know you understand things in a much more broad sense. But to go back to what we were talking about eliminating or reducing inputs for the health of a system and for its natural biological communities to thrive in a way that also works with the economy there. One thing that I've been really passionate about is not just eliminating or reducing inputs, but transforming them into something that is actually beneficial. So, for example, as we move into these higher levels of complexity, where we're taking out, let's say, synthetic inputs, machinery, and all of these things which have very limited function and very little nuance, is to actually bring in the actors and the components that can adapt to and actually facilitate the complexity and the nuance that we're trying to foster. So, in my opinion, that's bringing people back onto the land and taking away the simple functions of machinery that only allow for a very limited scope of management, whereas humans can really create relationship. And again, this is what I was talking about earlier, how cultures are what emerges from integrated stewardship of a landscape. I'm very passionate about, well, not only making more job opportunities, respectful livelihoods on the land, but also recognizing that the potential of a site, very much like you were talking about, in that you're not opposed to anthropogenic influence, that it shouldn't all be just gone to rewild. And how this reminds me of there are many different disturbance regimes in the succession of a landscape, but
Yeah.
actually the exclusion of disturbance is a disturbance in and of itself, right?
Oh, you nailed it. That's
And
absolutely true. Yeah,
and
yeah,
to remove human influence from an ecology is a type
yeah.
of disturbance in and of itself. To allow
Well,
something to fallow or to exclude our interaction with it is not
yeah,
necessarily beneficial. It just depends on the level of understanding and relationship that the people who are there have with it. What do you think about that? And do you see this as a potential for actually just transforming the inputs, not necessarily eliminating them?
well, definitely starting off with this idea of disturbance. And well, I think we've moved into the Anthropocene, so there's going to be a bit more disturbance to come, right?
Oh yeah,
It
yeah,
it doesn't it doesn't need to be necessarily a negative thing if it's done in a certain way, because I mentioned four good reasons why the Mediterranean is so biodiverse. But what I didn't mention is simply just extensive low intensity grazing, and specifically transhumance. So if you look at a map of the transhumance routes in Spain, you'll see that they run along these axes, north, south, east, west, and they're moving through different ecosystems. The cows are transporting seeds on their hooves. They're going to another location, and they are essentially mixing gene pools, and they're moving seed around. And also having the animals on the land creates this level of disturbance where therophytes, so annuals, essentially have like a bare earth patch, which has got warm soil. So the sun heats the soil and it's warm enough then for the seeds to germinate and they complete their life cycle. But then there's also like a Lepidoptera, some kind of butterfly that has a very close, intimate relationship with that specific annual. So there's really, when you think about a landscape, it's about disturbance, what can create the best level of disturbance, usually animals, usually livestock. So they're analogous to the wild animals we used to have in Europe that were more abundant. But disturbance can be managed, and it can be done in a way which is actually a positive force, and it's creating a series of microhabitats all around the landscape, which gives a more biodiverse gradient, or let's say a wider gradient of biodiversity options to exist, to occur. So having that sort of approach, not thinking about something to be either static or something to be, let's say, like untouchable. Nature is a living, breathing, dynamic system, and it's always going to evolve. It's always going to have disturbances. You're always going to get landslides, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, heavy floods, all of these things. But on a smaller scale, you're also going to get just the actions of a wild deer or a pig digging for truffles, and then you're going to get some annuals that will come in and grow on that patch. So thinking about that, that's all about soil health, and that's something I'm very passionate about, really. But there's different, like plowing is not a good way to create soil disturbance. Tillage is not a good way to create disturbance, right? But small scale disturbance can be good from livestock or from, just gardening. You're doing your beds and you create these small areas of disturbance. But yeah, I think going back to your question, were you also suggesting this idea of community interaction and sharing of resources? Was that something that you were?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's aspects of the culture that emerges from this. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you get like if you turn the clock back to before the First World War, when we invented synthetic chemicals, well, they weren't really widely adopted until the 1950s, let's say. But if you go back to pre-war, at some point, people would have been farming, of course, very specific crops to their location. And then, let's say in Portugal, where I did my grazing internship, it's famous for cherries. Mm-hmm. So they have like the best cherry in Portugal. It's really, this time of year, actually, May, June, you get all over Lisbon in the farmers markets and shops. It really only grows there, mm-hmm. due to a variety of quirks. People grow the cherry further north. It just doesn't have that sort of cultural. It's not a cultural icon. Doesn't define like that another region like it does there. Yeah. And through that, you have obviously an ecosystem of different businesses and like land management systems that are built around the cherry. So, thinking about that, it's like, what is specific to my place? And then how do I build an ecosystem around that from a business perspective and from a cultural perspective, and then you start having like festivals that are based around the cherry. You start having all these cultural offshoots and then the cherry becomes sacred and it becomes something that people want to look after. And when travelers visit the region, they're struck in the springtime by the beauty of the blossoms. And that's just like, am I in Japan? No, I'm not in Japan. I'm in Fundao. And you have this beautiful sea of cherry blossoms. So these things, these little historical quirks, I think, are super important to keep in the discourse, to maintain discussion about, and to really say there's nothing wrong with previous generations migrating to urban centers looking for work. That was just part of the period, and that just was what they had to do, right? But as a consequence, in the Mediterranean and many other places, you have a lot of rural land abandonment. So now I don't see that as a challenge. I see it as an opportunity for the next generation to come in and say, okay, cool, let's research what they used to do, but then let's give it the relevance of our generation and the needs and requirements of our generation, and also the needs and requirements of the new soil that's there now. Yeah. Right? After the abandonment, the ecosystem is slightly changed and there's different conditions. So then you have to invent a new cultural legacy that your next generation is going to inherit. And then they're going to modify it, and they're going to modify it. And the climate's going to change, but you can modify with that. So you can make it resilient. And all this, no need for like doom and gloom and pessimism. I think it's a fantastic time right now to have optimism and to, as you said, work from a community perspective and to understand the unique quirks of the landscape and its sort of microhabitats, its character, and all that good stuff. I think that's one way forward, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. I think human cultures can go through that same successional model the way plant communities do as well, right? And
Exactly.
the only unhealthy part of it is to remain stagnant, because these, just like plant communities can come back from massive disruption, so can human communities, and oftentimes even be better for it. Maybe you can't see it in the moment, but there's a lot of reason to be hopeful that this could bring about something even more beautiful, even more healthy in later iterations of this. But we have to start the work now. That's kind of the impetus. And that's one of the many things that gets me up in the morning. Like, how can I play my role in this place that I now have the privilege to steward, but also the real responsibility to care for? And I mean, it's an endless learning journey about where you fit within the existing community. In my case, working on learning the language, speaking with and understanding the neighbors and how they've lived. I mean, man, I could tell you some incredible stories from what I've learned around here of the grandmother of the woman who grew up in our house, who used to walk. I mean, it's a 20-minute drive from here, but she would walk through the mountains on foot to go and sell her eggs in the city next door to us. And I mean, that was not that long ago, right? That's absolutely within living memory. And okay, well, we have different tools now. We're under different conditions, the political climate, there's all these things that need to go into an informed design as well as an adaptive installation and maintenance of what it is that we're participating with. But it's endlessly fascinating and inspiring. It's one of my biggest passions to talk about and to teach some of the entry points into this way of living and interacting with the communities and the environments that we all interact with, whether we do so in a conscious way or if it's something that's just in our background up until now. But there are opportunities to participate regardless of your experience, your skill set, your passions, right? Like we were talking about how, let's say, the cherries opens up opportunities for festivals and industries, but there are also all of these add-on services and opportunities to support that may have nothing to do with caring for the trees or harvesting the fruit or getting it to market, right? It could be the healthcare worker who keeps those workers healthy and in good shape. The next, like, there's room for everybody here. And I think we could all at the same time benefit from a deeper understanding and relationship with these places that we're based.
Yeah, that's really nicely put. It's part of rebuilding rural communities that we've got in abundance here in Portugal and Spain.
Well, I think maybe this time it's a good place to put this bookmark in this discussion for today. I know that we're going to be closely in touch as we both work on building our properties and developing these educational centers that we're so passionate about. And I have gotten already so much inspiration and knowledge from you. I really look forward to continuing to learn and work together in the coming years, my friend.
Thank you so much, Oliver. And yeah, great to have the privilege to jump on your podcast and have a chat with you about everything that I've been up to. And I really enjoyed it. It was very inclusive. We really covered a lot of ground there.
We did cover a lot of ground, huh? This is super fun. We'll have to check in again real soon. Thanks once again to Henry. Like we mentioned at the end there, not all of the resources that Henry is working on are available yet, but I've put links to those which are in the show notes for this episode on the website, and I'll update it as soon as the others are live. Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from this show. Our Instagram account at regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.